The London and North Eastern Railway was the second largest of the four railway companies formed in 1923, which were brought together by legislation in 1948 to create the nationalised British Railways. The railway had pursued a big engine policy with regard to its express steam locomotive building programme, with more Pacific-type locomotives on its books than the other railways could muster together. Perhaps the most famous of all were the Gresley A4s, which appeared in the 1930s, and were unlike any other locomotive type anywhere else. A member of this class, Mallard, holds the world speed record for steam. This is her classmate, Union of South Africa, as she appeared in the 1950s and 60s, and is preserved today. Before we review the LNER locomotives that still run today, we're going to look at the post-nationalisation scene on Britain's East Coast main line, where for over a quarter of a century, LNER Pacific locomotives held sway. It may seem that they were there forever, but they first appeared only in 1922, when Sir Nigel Gresley introduced the first of his A1 class Pacifics on the Great Northern Railway. This was number 1470, which was renumbered within a year to 4470 of the LNER. Only two of the type appeared before the Great Northern was incorporated into the LNER, which continued to build the remainder of the order of 10 locomotives. A further order of 20 locomotives was put in hand at Doncaster Works in 1924, which included our first engine, Blink Bonnie, which we see on the East Coast main line with a special train in 4 different locations in 1964, the year in which she was withdrawn, a year of Holocaust for the A3s, which had at one stage comprised 79 locomotives. The earlier classification of A1 referred to the original Great Northern design, which was updated with higher superheating and a change from right to left-hand drive in the 1930s to form a new class of locomotive, the A3 class. The missing A2 designation referred to another LNER Pacific class, the Raven Pacifics of the North Eastern Railway, which had been rejected as a group standard upon the formation of the LNER and had been withdrawn in the 1930s. All the A1s were eventually rebuilt to the A3 specifications, and during British Railways ownership underwent further modifications, which included the fitment of double chimneys and the so-called elephant ear or German smoke deflectors or smoke troughs, which changed their appearance greatly. Another difference between individual locomotives, which can easily be discerned, is the fitment of different types of tender. This engine has the original design of Great Northern tender, with which they were originally produced, distinguished from the later tenders by the prominent coal rails. These can also be seen from above as the engine approaches Newcastle Central Station with a train from Edinburgh. Other features of the locomotives in their final form can be very clearly seen as Prince Palatine pauses and then continues towards the station. It will be noticed that she bears a yellow stripe on her cab side, apparently crossing out her number. This was to indicate she was banned from running south of Crewe on the West Coast main line. From the front, features which show up well are the deflectors and double chimney, the elongated steam dome known as the banjo dome for obvious reasons, and her cab-top ventilator. The enclosed Gresley cab was a major step forward for locomotive design, at a time when most railways, with the honourable exception of the North Eastern, provided very small open cabs for their locomotive crew's protection. Prince Palatine was the last of her class, being the only one to survive into 1966, except for her famous sister Flying Scotsman, withdrawn in 1963 but preserved. Another flying locomotive is Flying Fox, number 60106, which went at the end of 1964, the longest lived of all, and a popular rail tour engine in her last years. This train was a classic East Coast Express, with a complete train of LNER as opposed to British Railways coaches behind the A3. Sir Nigel Gresley was responsible for coach design as well as locomotive design, and produced a characteristic style with domed ends to the roofs, beaded panelling on the lower body sides, unusual bogies, and so on. They were as uniquely LNER as the locomotives of all classes, including, of course, the A3 Pacifics, two more of which we see here on shed. In the foreground is 60112 St Simon, which bore the last number in the A3 series, which ran from 60035 to 60112. They'd been renumbered in the immediate post-war years by Gresley's successor Thompson into a sequential number series, which put all the 6-foot 8-inch driving wheel locomotives at the beginning of the number series, the A3s following the A4s in their lists. St Simon was another late survivor, going at the end of 1964. Built as number 4481, she was the last of the original Great Northern ordered batch, and was the second longest lived of the class. An interim phase in their appearance, with double chimney and no deflectors, is seen on Gainsborough as she runs non-stop through York. This engine was built as an A3 at Doncaster in 1930. She's followed in the countryside by Melton, number 44. The engines were nearly all named after famous racehorses, winners of the various English classic races from the 1890s onwards. Melton was the first LNER ordered A1. She's followed by Gainsborough once again, now fitted with smoke deflectors, and passing Grantham in front of an enthusiastic crowd of loco spotters. The deflectors had been added as a result of the fitment in the late 1950s of the double chimney and exhaust, which had a softer blast than the original single chimney. This led to a tendency to drifting smoke obscuring the driver's vision, although that's not obvious on Captain Cuttle as the engine blasts through on an express. Our final A3 is Knight of Thistle. There's no "the" in the name. It was removed in 1932. She was an A1 rebuild. There were originally 79 A3s, but the very first Gresley Pacific of all, number 1470 Great Northern, was rebuilt by Thompson to form the prototype of a new class of A1s, which were developed by his successor, Arthur Peppercorn, into the very successful new A1 class, of which 60125 Scottish Union is the first we see. This was a class of 49 modern Pacifics, which were all produced under the auspices of British Railways in 1948 and 1949. The solitary Thompson rebuild made a total of 50 A1s. From the classic viewpoint above Newcastle's famous Diamond Crossings, an East Coast landmark, the next locomotive seen is Sir Vincent Raven, named after the North Eastern Railway's last locomotive engineer, and therefore appropriately viewed in true North Eastern territory, as she swings across the River Tyne and heads for Gateshead. Another bridge, this time at Peterborough North, is also an East Coast landmark, as 60139 Sea Eagle swings in. The station was a notorious bottleneck on the main line, because the platforms had to be entered at a snail's pace, as they were severely offset from the straight through of the main lines. As the locomotive prepares to depart, we can see the only obvious difference between the various batches of A1s, the form of the tender. Some engines had raised rivets on their tenders, whilst the others had flush-sided tenders. These latter were the locomotives built at Darlington, numbers 60130 to 60152, and show that Darlington, the old North Eastern Railway works, still had a degree of independence from Doncaster, the Great Northern works which had become the principal LNER works. Doncaster-built Kenilworth is the main locomotive featured in these detailed views of an engine undergoing its regular maintenance and preparation on shed. This shows what a dirty job maintaining the steam locomotive could be, and why British Railways, faced in the post-war era with a growing recruitment problem and increased manpower costs, had to dispose of the time-consuming steam engine in favour of electric and diesel locomotives. But what a shame. Peregrine looks a picture. She was a Darlington engine built in 1949. None was preserved, but a project has been launched to build from scratch the 50th locomotive of the class number 60163 Tornado. With a chassis from an A3 Pacific, will her tender be a riveted or non-riveted one? The A1s were a post-war development of the LNER Pacific theme, with the traditional layout of 3 cylinders. As a result of maintenance complications in the war, with the classic Gresley-derived valve gear for the middle cylinder, they had independent gear for each cylinder. Happily, the last members of the class were named after the principal railway companies which had formed the LNER, their nameplates sporting their crests. A.H. Peppercorn also produced a series of 6-foot 2-inch driving wheel diameter Pacifics, the A2 class, one of which, Blue Peter, survives today, as we'll see later. His predecessor Thompson had produced the first of these locomotives, intended as a group standard Pacific. Number 60523 Sun Castle is one of the 15 built new to his design. They were very ungainly machines, with their cylinders set back behind the front bogie, which made them look as if they'd been converted from locomotives with only one leading axle. In fact, many had. Thompson rebuilt Gresley's Class P2 282 express passenger engines to his A2 Pacific designation, and built the last 4 of the V2 262 engines as Pacifics. However, they could run fast. The most famous class of all has to be the A4 Pacifics, with their streamlined front ends. Although running like this, Miles Beaver would not find easy. The smokebox door was known as the Cod's Mouth, as it was really just a casing, revealing a true smokebox door within the streamlining. Sir Nigel Gresley's masterpiece was not just streamlined on the outside, but inside as well. Careful design ensuring that this update of the original A3 design was capable of high speeds. Internal steam passages were gas-flowed, whereas previous designers had paid scant attention to these aspects, with many right-angled joints in steam passages. The locomotives were built to run high-speed non-stop expresses, and to this end many were fitted with corridor tenders to enable them to work through to Scotland, changing crews during the run. These views are in Scotland, which is where the engines enjoyed a brief Indian summer in the early to mid-1960s, after they'd been displaced on the East Coast main line by diesels. Sir Nigel Gresley scaled down his A3 design as well. This produced the V2 262 mixed traffic design, one of which we see heading out of York on the Scarborough line. These locomotives, of which 184 were built, were the secondary mainline passenger engines, although they were frequently used on express services. In the 1950s and 60s, they sported the express passenger green livery of British Railways, and were at home on all kinds of work. This is a standard member of the class, number 60939, which shows how the A3s looked when they had single chimneys. A few V2s received names. This is St. Peter's School, York, AD 627. The class pioneer was also named Green Arrow, and she's preserved, so we'll see her again soon. Our first preserved LNER express passenger locomotive is seen on the Great Central Line, its native haunt. This is Butler Henderson, a member of the GCR's improved director class built in 1919, 3 years before the LNER was born. The locomotive belongs to the National Railway Museum at York and has spent most of its preservation career on the modern Great Central Railway, as it's the only example of the original Great Central's express passenger motive power to survive. It sported the elaborate Great Central livery for most of the 10 years it's worked on the GC. However, reserve steam locomotives can only be insured for a 10-year working period at a time, and after that they have to be completely overhauled. The director's 10 years were up at the beginning of 1992, and the opportunity was taken by enthusiasts on the railway to run it for its last weekend in its final service guise as British Railways number 62660. The engine was repainted black and given the fully lined livery on one side, and worked a number of trains over the February weekend, gathering a huge crowd of enthusiasts. It certainly gave everyone present a view of what Great Central Express passenger locomotives could do. The design was perpetuated by the LNER with new construction, the locomotives being classified as D11 by the company. On the other side, the engine was plain black. Butler Henderson was returned to GCR Green and to the National Railway Museum at York for static display after the weekend. As we saw in the archive section, Gresley's intermediate 262 locomotives, the V2 class, were frequently used on expresses, such was their versatility. The Pioneer locomotive, number 4771 Green Arrow, is preserved as another member of the National Railway Museum's collection. Green Arrow had a 7-year period of mainline running from 1986 to 1992, and much of her work was done on the Settle and Carlisle line, on which it became deservedly popular. The three-cylindered layout gives the engine considerable power, and she's proved to be nearly the equal of the Pacifics, which have frequented the route in the preservation era. V2s were classified 7 in the BR power classification system, which meant that Green Arrow was considered to be on a level with BR's own standard Pacifics, the Britannias. In early 1991, she had to contend with snow as she returned to train south in the late afternoon. At the summit, Aysgill, the engine showed no signs of being winded. Green Arrow has also worked on the North Wales Coast Express programme. In order to get there, she ran a train from Carnforth via the southern Manchester suburbs. Her trains on the North Wales coast were probably the first ever examples of a V2 on this line. Green Arrow was to retire from active work at the end of her mainline certificate in mid-1992. If the V2s were scaled-down A3s, the K4s were scaled-down V2s. Gresley did produce a cross between the two, the V4s, but only two were produced, and were early candidates for the scrapman. The K4s were also a small class, with only 6 examples built. This K4 survives. She's the Great Marquis, and she's been resident on the Severn Valley Railway for much of her preservation career. Although it's stretching a point to describe her as an express passenger locomotive, she's had to stand in for the greatest express passenger locomotive type of all, the A4s. In 1991, she had to take 2 trains northwards as substitute for Union of South Africa, and here we see her on the first of these from Marylebone. The second train took her up the Settle and Carlisle. The engines were classified as Class 6 in the British Railways power classification. The K4s were built specifically for use on the West Highland lines of the LNER, where they covered all types of traffic, including the through coaches from King's Cross. In 1990, 3442 revisited her old haunts and worked on the West Highland metals once again. This visit was perhaps the highlight of BR's steam workings from Fort William, which had been promoted annually from 1984. The K4 only spent 2 weeks in Scotland, returning to the Severn Valley via the Settle and Carlisle. The final train took her from Carnforth to Shrewsbury. Gresley's successor, Thompson, produced a series of all-rounders or mixed traffic engines, suitable for any kind of work, from freight to express passenger. Two examples are preserved, but only 1306 Mayflower has worked to date. Here she's seen on the Great Central with a fast train, a travelling post office. We now come to what is arguably the most famous steam locomotive in the world. Flying Scotsman was the LNER's very first express passenger locomotive, turned out of Doncaster Works in the second month of the railway's existence, February 1923. The engine was the third example of Sir Nigel Gresley's pioneering Pacific design, the first two having been built by the Great Northern Railway. She achieved early fame by being exhibited at the British Empire exhibition in 1924. The name was already familiar, as it was the same as the LNER's principal express train, the Flying Scotsman. Naming both locomotive and train the same could lead to confusion at times. Real fame came to the engine when it was preserved, the only example of the class to survive. She was bought by a Doncaster businessman, Alan Pegler, who negotiated a running arrangement with British Rail. At the cessation of BR steam running, the agreement still stood, and 4472 was the only steam locomotive allowed to work on the nationalised system for some years, before a break in the steam ban became a flood in the 1970s. Today she still works on the main lines, as we see here, amongst her most frequent haunts being the North Wales coast, as well as the Settle and Carlisle. The engine is a sure draw for crowds wherever she runs, as her name is known to all, and newspapers and television are willing to give her publicity which other locomotive owners would be glad to receive. Today, Flying Scotsman is owned by Sir William McAlpine, who also promoted Flying Scotsman Services, the organisation responsible for arranging the majority of steam specials on British railways. 2 coaching rakes are owned by the company, the chocolate and cream Pullmans, and a complete set of British Railways standard Mark I coaches in maroon. Scotsman has often been used for special workings. This is the Valentine Express, promoted by a travel company. Sir Nigel Gress's ultimate achievement was his streamlined A4 class, and one of these was named in honour of its illustrious designer and preserved. The engine was preserved directly out of BR traffic and ran a number of rail tours in the last years of mainline steam before the 1968 ban. It's always worked in preservation, bearing the pre-war number 4498 and the post-war blue livery with maroon wheels. Much of its work in the late 1980s was over the route from Marylebone, but it also visited the Settle and Carlisle. It was expected back in rail tour service in 1992. With the current popularity of the British Railways era amongst enthusiasts, Gresley's 11th A4, originally built as 4488 Osprey in 1937, has become one of the most popular mainline locomotives, as for some time it's been the only LNER engine in BR lime green livery. As number 6009, it's borne its original name for a while, as the name it bore throughout its service days was considered politically incorrect. Osprey never ran with this name, as before it was released for service by Doncaster Works, it was renamed Union of South Africa, and it bore this name until 1990. In that year, it was to be used on some high-profile specials, including the centenary of the Forth Bridge. Number 9, as the engine is frequently referred to, has worked all over the system, although she's based in Scotland, owned as she is by the chairman of ScotRail. She's considered to be the Scottish flagship and has worked on many trains throughout the country. She's also worked in Wales on both the Welsh Marches and North Wales Coast Express trains. It was whilst working from Crewe that one of the biggest surprises in preservation was sprung when number 9 appeared in the guise of a long-lost A4 60027 Merlin. Another change of identity was undertaken in Scotland when the engine became 6004 William Whitelaw to celebrate 150 years of the Edinburgh to Glasgow line. Lord Whitelaw was asked to officiate at the event, and the locomotive was renamed to commemorate his grandfather, an LNER director. After that run, number 9 reacquired her old number and her name, Union of South Africa. Her activities have become very widespread, and she's frequently worked trains to and from Hereford, as she's undergone major overhauls and maintenance on the Severn Valley Railway. The most famous A4 is, of course, Mallard, the world steam speed record holder at 126 miles an hour. Naturally, the locomotive is preserved as part of the National Railway Museum's collection. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of her record run in 1938, the engine was restored to full running condition in 1986 and ran a limited number of special trains from then until 1988. In 1988, she worked a series of excursions under the banner Mallard 88, which included work on the Settle and Carlisle. Uniquely amongst the preserved A4s, she sports the full streamlining as designed by Gresley, with valances over the wheels. After 1988, there were plans to run her again, but these came to naught, and she returned once again to be the star exhibit at the National Railway Museum in York. Only one of the post-war LNER Pacific survives, Blue Peter of Peppercorn's A2 class. After a long overhaul, she was returned to work in late 1991, with suitable publicity from the TV programme which shares her name. She ran in on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. In early 1992, she underwent a British Rail test run on the traditional route from Derby to Sheffield and back, with a massive test train. These tests are the only steam workings without a steam restriction imposed, as they're designed to stretch the engine to its limits before it's given a BR steam certificate. Normally 60 miles an hour is the maximum allowed for steam. On this run, Blue Peter reached 83 miles an hour. Following the award of its certificate, the engine was let loose on the Settle and Carlisle. The series of runs included 2 determined assaults on the southbound climb from Appleby to Aysgill, with the 60 mile an hour limit reached on a 1 in 100 gradient. The engine is said to be one of the stars of mainline running for a long time ahead. A project is currently underway to build a brand new example of the similar-looking A1 class, so LNER locomotive development has not yet finished.